They looked like innocence itself. Bright smiles, perfect timing, faces the whole country once adored. But when the applause faded, many of those young lives were left to carry something far heavier than fame. Behind the laughter were legal battles, addiction, scandal, loneliness, and grief. Tonight, we step past the spotlight and into the quieter truths their childhood stardom could not protect them from. Before we begin, please tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there. It is always a pleasure to see this community gathering from different places, sharing memories, reflections, and stories across the miles. Shirley Temple. At just 6, she became America's child star through Bright Eyes and other beloved films. Audiences adored the dimples, curls, songs, and impossible cheer. As adulthood approached, that legend had to be outgrown. She later rebuilt herself in public service and diplomacy. She died at 85, remembered as far more than the little girl the world first adored. River Phoenix. At 15, he became an icon after Stand By Me, carrying a gravity that felt older than his years. Viewers remembered the sensitivity, intensity, and quiet magnetism. But as fame deepened, so did the pressures around image and excess. He died of a drug overdose at 23, leaving one of Hollywood's most haunting, unfinished stories. Mickey Rooney. Still a boy, he became one of the nation's biggest stars through the Andy Hardy films. Audiences loved the speed, charm, and energy that made him unforgettable. Yet early success did not shield him from ruin. Financial troubles and personal chaos followed for decades. He died at 93, a legend whose long life never softened fame's cost. Bobby Driscoll. At about 5, he rose into Disney stardom with a warmth that made him feel instantly real. He was remembered for Peter Pan and So Dear to My Heart, but once childhood passed, the industry turned cold. Addiction, arrests, and obscurity followed. He died at 31, first unidentified, in one of old Hollywood's cruelest endings. Robert Blake. At 6, he entered our gang as Mickey Gubitosi and later became one of the child actors to conquer adult stardom. Audiences remembered the toughness and force he brought to Beretta. Then the spotlight darkened. His later life was overshadowed by scandal and a murder case that nearly erased his achievements. He died at 89, leaving a divided legacy. O'Rourke. At 6, she became unforgettable as Carol Ann in Poltergeist, with a sweetness that made the terror around her chilling. Viewers remembered the angelic voice, wide eyes, and innocence. But that brief childhood fame was cut short with suddenness. She died at 12 from medical complications, and her loss still lingers as one of Hollywood's saddest child star tragedies. Lautner. At 16, he became a worldwide sensation as Jacob in Twilight, transformed from teen actor into global obsession. Fans remembered the athletic charisma, heartthrob image, and frenzy that followed him everywhere. As the noise cooled, he stepped back instead of burning out. Now 34, he is remembered for choosing steadiness, privacy, and a life built on his own terms. Jonathan Brandis. By childhood, he was already acting, and by his teens, he had become a heartthrob through Sequest DSV and other favorites. Audiences remembered the gentle face, emotional sensitivity, and the boy everyone rooted for. But adulthood brought a harder silence when roles slowed. He died at 27, and his story remains a reminder of how fame can unsettle identity. Shia LaBeouf. As a boy, he broke through on Even Stevens with a comic spark that made him one of his generation's young performers. Viewers remembered the chaos, wit, and raw energy that made him impossible to ignore. But adult fame turned harsher. Arrests, addiction struggles, and controversy followed. Now 39, he remains a troubled figure, still trying to rebuild. Brad Renfro. At 11, he stunned audiences in The Client with a naturalism that felt far beyond his age. He was remembered for the wounded honesty that made his early performances striking. But once the first wave of fame faded, addiction and arrests took over the story. He died from an overdose at 25, leaving one of the heartbreaking downfalls. Freddie Highmore. At 7, he began acting professionally and soon stood out as a child performer of unusual poise. Audiences remembered Finding Neverland and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory for the intelligence and restraint he brought to both. As he grew older, fame never seemed to consume him. Now 34, he is admired for turning early promise into disciplined, lasting success. Corey Feldman. By age 3, he was already working, and by the 1980s, he had become one of Hollywood's most recognizable young faces. Audiences remembered The Goonies and Stand By Me, along with his wild charisma. But the years after childhood brought addiction, chaos, and painful revelations. Now 54, he is remembered as both a survivor and a warning. Jackie Coogan. Before 7, he became one of the first true movie child superstars through The Kid. Audiences remembered the sad eyes, natural pathos, and silent-era magnetism that made him unforgettable. But adulthood brought betrayal when his earnings were gone. He later helped inspire legal protections for child actors. He died at 69, leaving both cultural and legal history behind. Jay North. The era's most familiar child star images. Viewers remembered the grin, the troublemaking charm, and the impossible energy. But once the series ended, the damage beneath the surface grew harder to ignore. He died at 73, remembered with affection and sadness for what fame cost him. Jackie Cooper, your child star in Skippy. Audiences remembered the earnestness, emotional clarity, and ease that made him so watchable. Unlike many others, he truly crossed into adult success. He died at 88, remembered for one of the longest and most distinguished careers to grow from childhood fame. Jake Lloyd. Audiences remembered the wide-eyed innocence and the burden of carrying a role so heavily debated. But fame turned harsh with bullying, scrutiny, and later mental health struggles. Now 37, his story remains one of the clearest reminders that early visibility can become a heavy lifelong weight. Deanna Durbin. Universal in difficult years. Audiences remembered the golden voice, fresh warmth, and graceful charm that made her luminous. But instead of staying captive to fame, she walked away. She died at 91, remembered for choosing privacy over applause and preserving dignity on her own terms. Johnny Crawford. Success as well. Viewers remembered the sincerity, warmth, and boyish grace that made him feel familiar. As adulthood unfolded, the image softened into nostalgia and illness. He died at 75, remembered as one of television's most beloved boys turned bittersweet memory. Tommy Kirk. As dog, audiences remembered the earnest face and clean-cut energy that defined the studio's family image. But adult life brought addiction and rejection. He died at 79, remembered as a Disney boy whose later years carried pain beyond what his early film suggested. Margaret O'Brien. Audiences remembered Meet Me in St. Louis and the extraordinary emotion in her small, luminous face. Unlike so many others, her life did not unravel after early fame. Now 89, she is remembered with admiration for grace, steadiness, and enduring classic Hollywood poise. Carl Switzer. At key songs and comic devotion, audiences loved the awkward sweetness that made him one of the series' most recognizable faces. But adulthood offered only smaller jobs and mounting frustration. He was fatally shot at 31, remembered as a child star icon whose ending felt cruelly abrupt. John Provost. At family dramas, viewers remembered the sincerity, bright-eyed warmth, and easy bond that made the role endure. When childhood fame passed, he chose a quieter path instead of collapse. Now 76, he is remembered with affection, steadiness, and lasting television grace. Baby Peggy. Before she was even old enough for school, she had become one of silent cinema's biggest child sensations. Audiences remembered the tiny face, fearless comic energy, and astonishing workload that made her a phenomenon. But the fortune vanished and the childhood was spent. She died at 101, remembered as both a legend and a witness to exploitation. Danny Lloyd. At 6, he was cast as Danny Torrance in The Shining, giving one of horror's most haunting child performances. Audiences remembered the stillness, vulnerability, and quiet fear in his eyes. But he never stayed trapped inside that fame. He stepped away, built a private academic life, and is now 53, admired for choosing calm over lifelong performance. Billy Laughlin. At 8, he became Froggy in Our Gang, a small star with a strange, raspy voice and beautifully understated timing. Audiences remembered him instantly because no one else sounded or felt quite the same. But after the series, ordinary boyhood returned only briefly. He died at 16 after a traffic accident, leaving one of the cruelest early losses. Carrie Henn. At 10, she became Newt in Aliens and gave the film much of its fragile emotional core. Viewers remembered the fear, innocence, and trembling resilience that made her impossible to forget. But she never chased a long Hollywood future. She chose ordinary life instead, later becoming a teacher. Now 49, she is remembered for one role that never faded. Matthew Beard. At 5, he joined Our Gang as Stymie, the sharp little scene stealer in the derby hat. Audiences loved the wit, swagger, and comic ease that made him instantly stand out. But after the cameras moved on, addiction and jail darkened his path. He later recovered and found work again. He died at 56, remembered for resilience as much as charm. Beverly Washburn. At 3, she began acting and soon became one of the wholesome young faces of 1950s film and television. Audiences remembered Old Yeller and the emotional sincerity that made her tears feel real. Unlike so many child stars, she never became a public tragedy. Now 82, she is remembered for resilience, dignity, and a life that stayed intact. Scotty Beckett. At 3, he entered pictures and later became one of the familiar young faces linked to Our Gang and beyond. Audiences remembered the mischievous charm and easy screen appeal that made him seem born for cameras. But adulthood turned dark with addiction, arrests, and collapse. He died at 38, remembered as one of child stardom's bleakest cautionary tales. Barry Livingston. Still a boy, he joined My Three Sons as Ernie and became a familiar face in American living rooms. Audiences remembered the gentle awkwardness and likable younger brother warmth he brought to the role. Unlike many former child stars, he kept adapting. Now 72, he is remembered for steady work, perspective, and a life that never turned sensational. McFarland. At 3, he became Spanky, the heart of Our Gang and one of its most recognizable child stars. Audiences remembered the confidence, comic authority, and impish charm that made him feel older than the others. After childhood fame, adult roles proved harder to find. He died at 64, remembered as one of the Little Rascals' most enduring symbols. Stevens. At 5, he entered films and soon gave one of British horror's most unforgettable child performances. Audiences remembered Village of the Damned and the Innocents for the eerie calm and intelligence in his face. But when childhood fame passed, he chose ordinary life over reinvention. Now 76, he is remembered for stepping away without bitterness or public collapse. Wild. At 11, he became unforgettable in Shane, delivering a performance filled with wonder, fear, and heartbreaking sincerity. Audiences remembered the raw emotion that made him seem almost too real for the screen. Unlike many child stars, he kept working into adulthood. Then a traffic accident ended that second act. He died at 30, remembered for promise cut painfully short. Mara Hobel. At 9, she left a lasting mark as young Christina Crawford in Mommy Dearest, holding her own in an intense film. Audiences remembered the concentration, emotional force, and unusual maturity she brought to the role. Instead of chasing chaos, she kept creating more quietly. Now in her mid-50s, she is remembered for turning early notice into a steadier life. Claude Jarman Jr. At 12, he became a child star standout in The Yearling, bringing honesty to a difficult role. Audiences remembered the emotion and innocence that earned him a Juvenile Academy Award. But adulthood did not become a spectacle of collapse. He moved into film culture and leadership instead. He died at 90, remembered for dignity, intelligence, and a balanced second life. Tony Dow. At 12, he became Wally Cleaver on Leave It to Beaver, the calm older brother in one of television's defining families. Audiences remembered the easy smile, athletic ease, and dependable warmth he carried on screen. After childhood fame, he kept creating through directing and sculpture while facing depression and cancer. He died at 77, remembered with deep affection. Tommy Rettig. At 12, he became the first boy partner to Lassie, bringing warmth and sincerity to one of television's earliest family institutions. Audiences remembered the gentle face and natural ease that made him instantly likable. But adulthood brought legal trouble and distance from show business. He rebuilt himself in software. He died at 54, remembered for reinvention and nostalgia. Stanley Livingston. By 10, he was nationally known as Chip on My Three Sons, growing up in front of millions through a family show. Audiences remembered the clean-cut steadiness and comfort he brought to the series. Unlike many child actors, he stayed close to the business without scandal. Now 75, he is remembered for professionalism, longevity, and a stable path. Norman Chaney. At 14, he became chubby in Our Gang, winning audiences with his round face, comic timing, and instantly lovable frustration. Viewers remembered him as one of the sound era's most distinctive little stars. But once childhood fame faded, severe health troubles took over. He died at 21, remembered as one of the series' earliest and most heartbreaking losses. Bonita Granville. By 14, she had already earned an Oscar nomination for these three, proving she was far more than a passing child novelty. Audiences remembered the sharp intelligence and poise that made her stand out. When acting slowed, she did not disappear. She moved into producing and business leadership. She died at 65, remembered for turning talent into lasting influence. Billy Thomas. At about 4, he became buckwheat in Our Gang and turned a supporting child role into one of the series' most lasting images. Audiences remembered the bright grin, comic innocence, and lines that stayed in popular memory. After childhood fame, he chose a quieter adulthood. He died at 49, remembered as one of the Little Rascals' most beloved faces. Mickey Daniels. At 8, he was one of the original stars of Our Gang, bringing lively energy to the series' earliest years. Audiences remembered the bright smile, comic timing, and charm that made him central to the silent era troupe. But adulthood turned painfully bleak through alcoholism and decline. He died at 55, remembered as one of the forgotten casualties of early fame. Freddie Bartholomew. At 10, he arrived in Hollywood as the perfect English boy and quickly became one of the decade's most polished young stars. Audiences remembered the cherubic face, careful diction, and remarkable poise in prestige pictures. But lawsuits and overwork shadowed that success. He later reinvented himself in broadcasting. He died at 67, remembered for grace under strain. Tommy Bond. At 5, he entered Our Gang and later became unforgettable as Butch, the swaggering bully who tormented Alfalfa with comic menace. Audiences remembered the tough kid bravado and the face that could be feared and loved at once. Unlike many child actors, he built a solid adult career in television work. He died at 79, remembered with affectionate nostalgia. Alan Hoskins. Still a toddler, he became Farina in Our Gang and broke ground as one of the series' first major black child stars. Audiences remembered the expressive face, unusual screen presence, and historic place in early comedy shorts. After childhood fame, he chose service and ordinary work over spotlight. He died at 59, remembered as both pioneer and gentle survivor. Sidney Kibrick. At 5, he joined our gang and later became famous as the scrappy little William, sidekick to neighborhood bully Butch. Audiences remembered the comic irritation, tough energy, and tiny frame that made him instantly recognizable. When childhood acting ended, he built a quiet adult life. He died at 97, remembered as a living bridge to the original era. Marianne Jackson. At 5, she became one of our gang's standout girls, impossible to miss with her Dutch-cut hair, freckles, and tomboy spark. Audiences remembered the mischief, individuality, and lively spirit she brought to the series. But after childhood fame, she chose ordinary life instead of Hollywood pursuit. She died at 80, remembered for the bright energy she left behind. Soyi Kevin Corcoran. At 6, he became a Disney favorite, often known as Moochie, with the freckled mischief that made him instantly memorable. Audiences remembered Old Yeller and the comic little brother energy he brought to family films. Rather than force an adult acting career, he moved behind the camera. He died at 66, remembered for a graceful reinvention inside the business. Eugene Porky Lee. At 2, he became Porky in Our Gang, a tiny star whose sweetness made him beloved. Audiences remembered the round face, toddler charm, and comic presence that gave the later shorts extra warmth. After leaving film, he chose a quieter path away from celebrity. He died at 71, remembered for the innocence and affection tied to his little screen image. Bobby Hutchins. At 2, he joined our gang and became beloved as Weezer, a bright little presence with an easy photogenic charm. Audiences remembered the playful face and lively spirit that made him stand out even in crowded casts. But adulthood never had time to begin. He died at 20 in a military training collision, remembered as a promise cut heartbreakingly short. Darla Hood. At 4, she became the sweet leading girl of our gang, bringing music, charm, and a gentle glow that set her apart. Audiences remembered the soft voice, bright presence, and easy warmth she carried on screen. Unlike many child stars, she stayed in entertainment for years. She died at 47, remembered as the series' graceful little lady. David Doremus. At 7, he was already working in front of cameras and soon became familiar to television audiences through Nanny and the Professor and later The Waltons. Viewers remembered the calm sincerity and clean-cut warmth that suited family television well. When acting ended, he chose ordinary life. Now in his late 60s, he is remembered with quiet affection. Some found peace, some found purpose, some were gone far too soon, but each of them left behind more than a role, a smile, or a moment on screen. They left a warning about fame, childhood, and the hidden cost of being loved too early. If one story stayed with you tonight, share it in the comments, and please do not forget to like, subscribe, and remember them.